The bicycle has been a notable part of my guest's life since elementary school. While a childhood toy for most of us, the bike became an integral part of John Frederick's life. He joins me to talk about his life on the bike, notably his first 15 years bicycling, and the book that tells that story, Winding Roads, A Bicyclist's Journey Through Life and America. How you doing, John?
Good. Great to be with you.
Why the decision to write a book?
The story was an amazing story, amazing experience, particularly my cross-country bicycle trip. When I sat down to begin the process of putting it on paper, I realized that the beginning of the story really went back a lot further than just a cross-country bike trip. And so it ended up being a story that began when I struggled to keep the bicycle going in a straight line and not falling off of it, which I did often when I was in first and second grade.
You got a tricycle for Christmas, 1959. Then you got the 24-inch two-wheeler for your 6th birthday. And you talk about the fact that it was a simpler time back then, and you were able to get out of your neighborhood and travel around. And it was really great getting your freedom through your bicycle then, wasn't it?
It was. And you went everywhere on your bicycle. I mean, to church, to the library, to visit your grandparents, go to your friend's house, to go play baseball. It didn't matter what it was. If it was within a reasonable distance, you got on the bike and you went. It was easy to get from one place to another, and it was just part of growing up, and you rode when you could, and you did things and explored things. It's harder to do that these days.
John Frederick joins us. His book, Winding Roads, A Bicyclist's Journey Through Life and America. A lot of kids, when they get in their teens, they forget about the bike. You went to Penn State after graduating from high school. And why did you keep riding your bike?
The funny thing is that I really wasn't a very good athlete when I was younger. It took me a long time to even figure out how to ride a bike with any degree of proficiency. When I got to be junior high age, a couple of friends and cousins and so forth did a lot of bicycling too around the neighborhood. We snuck off to other neighborhoods without our parents' knowledge and things like that. And it was, kind of a revolutionary thing for us to do. But as those couple of years passed, I realized that I wasn't too bad at it. So I started to ride more and more, put more miles on, and dabbled in a couple of races and some things like that, and realized it was something that I could do pretty well and enjoyed it. And I enjoyed the opportunity to get out and explore central Pennsylvania, too, for that matter. And a couple of the people that really pushed me forward in the sport kind of had that same sort of attitude. And that was part of the adventure. It just wasn't about going fast, but it was about seeing things and going places that you hadn't gone and seen before.
You graduate from Penn State in 1978. You make the decision that you're going to go cross-country, make this cross-country trip. Where did that decision come from, and when did you start thinking of doing that?
I took a bicycling phys ed class at Penn State. There were a couple of people who had done some long-distance riding. There was one kid that had actually ridden across the country. And when I realized that I could ride with those guys, it struck me that it was possible for me to do something like that it was within my physical capabilities. Sometimes, it's more than just the physical part of it, though. I mean, especially when you're doing this kind of mileage over literally 4.5 weeks or something like that. And the mental part of it was harder at times than what the physical part was. Because on top of everything else, that you have to try to understand that there were all sorts of other things that took place besides the bicycling. I mean, you had to worry about where you were sleeping. You had to make sure you had enough water and food. You had to find some place to do your laundry. There were times where we couldn't find places to do laundry, and we didn't really have a hot shower to take advantage of. And we didn't smell too good at times. But, you didn't have a choice. Those were the things that happened sometimes. And I think one of the other things that people don't realize is that 20 miles in a car is 15 or 20 minutes. On a bicycle, with the wrong wind, it's an hour and 15, hour 20 minutes. And sometimes with bad weather, it's a pretty miserable hour and 15 minutes.
You talked about persistence, patience, mental toughness. What kept you going?
I guess it was the ultimate goal. They always make that joke about, why you climb Mount Everest, because it's there. And I guess that was part of it. But, it was also just part of the overall adventure. One of the things I say in the book at some point is that bicycling is kind of like the Goldilocks of traveling. It's not so slow that you're not able to cover very much ground, but not so fast that things are flying by at a pace that you really can appreciate what you're seeing and going through. When you're doing something at 15 to 20 miles an hour, you see things in a much different way than you do when you're on the interstate going 65. When you're planning a trip like this, people often say, well, you want to go from west to east because the predominant winds in America blow west to east. And that's a bunch of nonsense. Maybe the wind blows a little bit more from west to east than east to west. But the summer that we went, it was a strange weather year, and there were lots of easterly and southeasterly winds during that time. And when that happens, you also get a lot of Gulf moisture moving further west than what you normally would. And so we had a spell of like 2 weeks in a row where we had a thunderstorm, at least one thunderstorm every day. As some of the listeners might know, thunderstorms in the plains can be pretty nasty affairs. There were more than a few times we had some wild and crazy experiences, thunderstorms and hail and high winds and a dust storm in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I mean, it was just, we had a little bit of everything.
During that trip, were there times when you really looked around and realized what a tremendous country the United States is, the landscape, the things you were doing, what you were seeing?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The one that sticks out in my mind most is the ride along the Columbia River. The Columbia makes the border between Washington and Oregon. It cuts through a bunch of volcanic rocks, and there's all these cliffs and waterfalls. And we took a long time to cover that 75 or 100 miles there east of Portland because we just kept stopping to take pictures and look at the waterfalls. And it was just an incredible experience, a beautiful place. And it's probably one of the most underrated parts of the United States. People talk about going to the Grand Canyon or to Yellowstone. I think sometimes the Pacific Northwest is not given its due.
You talk about we, and I'd be remiss not to ask who the we are, how many people were involved with you at times, and did everyone stay with you the entire trip?
We started off, Ken Steele, the legendary bicyclist who met his early death in a fire. He was a city fireman. He was a great mentor of mine, and he went with us the first few weeks of the trip, but had work obligations and couldn't go the whole way with us. He was always a great guy to have along for many, many reasons. There were two other people, a young lady that was active in the cycling club, Anita Petruski, and Tom Baldwin, a school teacher, that were going to go the whole way with us. And then I had a classmate from Penn State University, John Menke, who ultimately went the whole way with me. Tom and Anita found it to be too taxing an experience, but they did ride with us for several weeks. Still had a wonderful time and experience despite their frustration over the difficulty of the trip. It was a great group. That was part of the experience for sure.
When you were coming down to the end of the ride, what were your feelings?
The last few days, I was actually by myself. John Menke, my college classmate, had family in Long Island, and he took a more northerly route. And I was by myself and had a couple of great days even by myself. I stayed with a great aunt and uncle in Freeport, Pennsylvania the last night I was on the road. And it was the first time that I had seen anyone that I knew besides riding partners. That by itself was kind of an interesting experience. That last day, it's kind of hard to describe even now. I can remember coming down Sugar Run Road and thinking, well, I'm not too far now. And I can remember vividly making the last climb up to my house in the Fifth Ward. You know, everybody kind of came to the front porch and cheered as I rode down this street and up the driveway. And, you know, it was obviously kind of a neat thing to do. I was actually, by the way, for one of the very few times in my life, I was tired of bicycling, and I actually took a few days off.
The book, Winding Roads, A Bicyclist's Journey Through Life and America, John Frederick, the author, joins us. How did this trip and your years of riding change your focus and how you view life?
Well, it's kind of a strange thing, and I didn't plan this, but when I was a freshman in college, I was a journalism major, and I thought that I would write for a living. I also thought, well, I really enjoyed studying nature and the natural world and the environment, kind of an interesting thing too. And I ended up as a geography major. What I didn't realize when I did that was that my major and my favorite hobby actually went hand in glove really well, because going back to that idea that it was the perfect speed to see the world, it was a neat thing to be able to study the things that I was learning about in school as I rode through them, so to speak, here in central Pennsylvania and other places that I rode and raced as well. And so that was kind of a serendipity of sorts, because I had not planned it, but it worked out very well in the end.
What do you see as the future of cycling, in particular with electric bikes? What's your view on that?
Well, yeah, I think electric bikes have their place, especially when people get older. I think the technology is such that it's not an obtrusive sort of thing. I'll tell you that a pet peeve I have, with all due respect to the folks that have these, are these lawnmower engines that they attach to bicycles, which are noisy and are very polluting and kind of an unpleasant sort of thing. I mean, I think part of the bicycling experience should be the quiet and solitude that comes with that mode of transportation. That's the great thing about the electric bike, is that it allows people who maybe have some physical limitations to do more and go further without upsetting that apple cart of peace and tranquility that should come with a bicycle ride. I mean, I've had many hours of thoughtful contemplation on the bike, and I just don't think that's possible to do that, on an ATV or a snowmobile or something like that. It should also be, I would be remiss if I didn't say this, I think it also should be a worthwhile mode of transportation. The Dutch and the Dane, particularly, the bicycle is an important part of their transportation system. And that's one of the reasons why I'm working in Annis Township, because we're trying to make a system of trails here in Blair County a reality. I think that's the next big step to us bringing the bicycle into a more prominent place in Blair County and for Blair Countians.
Well, I think the biggest challenge may have been writing a book, but I think an even bigger challenge is you coming up with an amusing or bizarre story about all your years of cycling and something that happened.
Well, there are many, Joe. But I'm going to do one from the book that'll be a bit of a spoiler, but maybe it will also whet some appetites for prospective readers of the book. I mentioned earlier that we had so many stormy days on the road, and one of those happened just before July the 4th on the cross-country trip. And we got to a little town called Wood Lake, Nebraska. And, of course, once again, there were thunderstorms and violent thunderstorms and tornado warnings in the forecast. And we were staying at the town park in Wood Lake. And now Wood Lake's like 25 houses, a bar, and a gas station. And while we're there, we were approached by two young ladies. They talked with us at length and then asked us if we'd buy them beer. And we thought better of that. Later on, the fire chief came to the campsite. He said, would you guys like to maybe stay in the firehouse tonight? He said, we're afraid there's going to be some nasty storms. Well, of course, we took him up on that immediately. And as we're unpacking our stuff and, trying to figure out what we're going to have for supper, he says, now listen, if you hear a tornado coming, maybe you want to climb under one of the fire trucks. We looked under the fire trucks and said, okay, we'll do that. And I said, well, how do we know if we hear a tornado? And he said, well, it sounds a lot like a train coming down the street. And he said, the train doesn't run in Wood Lake anymore. So if you hear a train, he says, you better get the hell under the trucks. We didn't hear any trains that night, but the next evening, I ended up being separated from my riding partner and ended up at a roadside rest about 70 miles or 80 miles down the road. And we had one hellacious storm. And I'm laying there and the winds are blowing and the lightning is flashing and there's hailstones coming down. The high winds are blowing branches out of the trees. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm here by myself. There's nobody around. This is perfect tornado weather. And I'm laying there thinking, what am I going to do? And I hear a train. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, this is just what the guy said at the last town we were in. And the train sound keeps getting louder and louder and louder. And I think, oh my God, it's a tornado. What am I going to do? So I grabbed my stuff thinking, well, I need to figure out the best place to be right now. And there I see it coming right at me. And it was a train. And it turned out that while the train did not run through Wood Lake, Nebraska, it did run through the next town. I was never so happy in my entire life to see a train moving towards me. And that's one of my funny stories from the book.
So how can people get your book? And, of course, you have a website. Explain how they get in touch with you on your website.
My website's www.johnjfrederick.com. There's 2 E's in Frederick. You can buy it right from my website, and it's also available on a couple of the other outlets for books. My website has other little tidbits on it, too. People might enjoy taking a look at those things as well.
Once again, thanks for joining us. Apparently you weren't injured during the possible tornado, and you were on the right track, weren't you?
I guess I was.
Thanks for joining us once again.
All right, thanks.